The day I posted private lake, keep out signs around what the HOA claimed was community property, was the day I discovered that sometimes the best revenge comes from simply telling the truth. You see, Margaret Thornfield, our HOA president, had just slapped me with a $500 fine for unauthorized recreational activities on community waterfront property, all because I'd been fishing from my own dock with my late father's vintage rod. But what Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd inherited more than just my childhood home when Dad passed 6 months ago. I'd inherited the lake itself. And when I finally decided to exercise my property rights, well, let's just say the Lakeside Estates community got a very expensive lesson in who really owned their precious waterfront paradise. If you've ever dealt with an HOA power trip, drop a comment below, because trust me, this story is going to make your blood boil before it makes you cheer. I never wanted to be the villain in someone else's story, but Margaret Thornfield made that choice for me. My name is Sarah Chen, and 6 months ago, I was just a 34-year-old software engineer who'd moved back to my childhood home in Lakeside Estates to settle my father's affairs. Dad had raised me alone after Mom died when I was 12, and our evening fishing trips on the lake behind our house were some of my most treasured memories. The house sits on 2 acres with a gentle slope down to the water and a small wooden dock that Dad built when I was 15. He taught me how to cast a line from that dock, how to read the water for the best fishing spots, how to be patient and respectful of the natural world around us. Those evenings weren't just about catching fish, they were about connection, about the kind of peace you can only find when you're sitting in comfortable silence with someone you love, watching the sun set over calm water. When Dad had his heart attack last February, I was living in Seattle, buried in the tech world, working 60-hour weeks and wondering why I felt so empty despite my 6-figure salary. His death hit me like a freight train, and the guilt was overwhelming. Here was this man who'd sacrificed everything to raise me, who'd worked double shifts to pay for my computer science degree, who'd never once made me feel like a burden even though he'd never remarried, never had the life he might have wanted. And I'd been too busy climbing the corporate ladder to spend real time with him in his final years. So when I inherited the house, the decision felt obvious. I took a remote consulting position and moved back to Lakeside Estates. The plan was simple: settle the estate, renovate the house, and figure out how to honor Dad's memory while building a life that actually meant something. The community had changed dramatically. What used to be middle-class families had transformed into an upscale development with manicured lawns and residents who drove BMWs instead of pickup trucks. But the lake was still the same. Still that perfect mirror surface in the early morning, still home to the same families of ducks and the occasional great blue heron. And Dad's fishing rod was still hanging in the garage, a beautiful vintage Fenwick fly rod that he'd bought as a young man and maintained religiously for over 40 years. The leather grip was worn smooth from decades of use, and I could still smell the faint scent of the linseed oil he'd used to condition the cork handle every spring. The first week I was back, I spent every evening on that dock, casting Dad's line and trying to process my grief. It wasn't really about the fish, though I did catch a few nice bass that reminded me of the ones Dad and I used to pull from these same waters. It was about feeling connected to him, about carrying on a tradition that had defined our relationship for as long as I could remember. That's when I first encountered Margaret Thornfield. I was sitting on the dock on a Thursday evening when I heard the sharp click of heels on concrete behind me. I turned to see a woman in her early 60s marching down my driveway like she owned the place. She was perfectly put together in that aggressive suburban way, blonde hair in a rigid bob, crisp white blouse, and an expression that suggested she'd never met a rule she didn't want to enforce twice as hard. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that managed to be both syrupy sweet and razor sharp. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. You must be Henry's daughter. I'm so sorry for your loss." I stood up, fishing rod still in hand, and tried to be polite. "Thank you. Yes, I'm Sarah Chen." Margaret's smile never reached her eyes. "How wonderful. Now, I hate to bring this up so soon, but I noticed you've been fishing from the community dock quite regularly." Community dock. The words hit me like a slap. "I'm sorry, what?" "This is my dock. My father built it. Her laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, sweetie, I think there might be some confusion. According to our community bylaws, any structure that extends into the lake is considered community property. The lake itself is a shared amenity for all residents of lakeside estates." I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. This dock that held 30 years of memories, where Dad had taught me everything I knew about patience and persistence, where we'd sat in comfortable silence watching eagles fish and herons hunt, this woman was telling me it wasn't mine to use. "You're telling me I can't fish from my own dock? From property my father owned for over 30 years. From the community dock, dear." And the answer is no, not without proper authorization. But don't worry, I'm prepared to be very reasonable about this transition period. She gestured toward my father's rod like it was a piece of contraband. Unauthorized fishing equipment on community property is a violation of Section 12.3 of our covenant. She pulled a manila folder from her handbag. "Here's a copy of all relevant bylaws. I'll give you 2 weeks to remove any personal fishing equipment and familiarize yourself with the proper procedures. The next community fishing event is scheduled for Memorial Day weekend." As I watched her click back up my driveway, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just about fishing. This was about power, about someone who decided that my family's 30-plus years in this community meant nothing compared to her vision of proper suburban order. The folder contained 47 pages of regulations that basically boiled down to, the HOA controls everything. According to their interpretation, any structure touching the water was subject to community oversight. All recreational activities required advance written approval, and violations could result in fines starting at $200. I decided to try the diplomatic approach first. I called Margaret's office and scheduled a meeting to discuss my situation. Maybe if I explained the sentimental value of fishing from Dad's dock, she'd be willing to work with me. I should have known better. The meeting was held in Margaret's living room, which looked like a cross between a corporate boardroom and a museum dedicated to aggressive suburban achievement. She'd invited 2 other board members, Dale Hoffman and Patricia Vance, who took notes like she was preparing for litigation. "Sarah, I'm so glad you reached out," Margaret began, settling into her chair like a queen holding court. "It shows real community spirit." I tried to explain my situation calmly and reasonably. The dock was on my property. Fishing had been a cherished tradition with my father. I wasn't interfering with anyone else's enjoyment of the lake. I was quiet, respectful, and usually fished alone during off-peak hours when most residents weren't even using the waterfront areas. Margaret listened with the kind of patronizing attention you'd give to a child explaining why they should be allowed to stay up past bedtime. "I understand this is emotional for you, dear. Losing a parent is never easy. But we have to think about the broader community here. If we make exceptions for one person, where does it end? What about the Johnsons, who want to put in a swimming platform? Or the Garcias, who think they should be able to launch their kayaks whenever they want? Rules exist for a reason." The conversation went in circles for 45 minutes. Finally, Margaret leaned forward with her signature move, false kindness preceding the killing blow. "Tell you what, Sarah. I can see how much this means to you. So I'm prepared to offer a compromise. You can apply for a special recreational permit that would allow you to fish during designated off-peak hours, Tuesday and Thursday mornings between 6 and 8 a.m., and Sunday afternoons between 1 and 3 p.m. There would be a $150 annual fee, and you'd need to provide advance notice for each fishing session." I stared at her. "You want me to pay you $150 a year and file paperwork every time I want to fish from my own dock?" "From the community dock, dear. That's the compromise I'm willing to offer." I left feeling like I'd been mugged. But I still wasn't ready to escalate, so I submitted the application, paid the fee, and spent the next month fishing only during approved time slots after filing the required 48-hour advance notice forms. It was humiliating. The administrative hoops were clearly designed to be punitive. Each form required detailed information about planned fishing duration, expected number of fish caught, type of bait or lures to be used, and confirmation that I'd reviewed all relevant safety regulations. But I told myself it was temporary, that once Margaret saw I was willing to work within the system, maybe the restrictions would be relaxed. Instead, they got worse, and Margaret's surveillance became increasingly obsessive. In May, I received a formal complaint letter stating that I'd been observed fishing outside my approved time window. The violation occurred when I'd arrived at the dock 15 minutes early and had spent those minutes sitting quietly, rod still in its case, watching the sunrise and thinking about Dad. But apparently Margaret had been watching from her kitchen window with binoculars, documenting my unauthorized presence on community property. The fine was $200, and the letter included a grainy photograph taken through Margaret's window showing me sitting peacefully on the dock. A week later, another complaint for failure to properly secure recreational equipment because I'd left Dad's tackle box on the dock overnight after an evening fishing session. The regulation I'd allegedly violated was buried on page 38 of the HOA handbook and specified that all personal items must be removed from community areas within 30 minutes of use completion. Another $200 fine. Then came the complaint about my disruptive fishing techniques. Apparently, my fly casting was creating excessive water disturbance that was interfering with the lake's natural serenity. I'd been fly fishing exactly the way Dad taught me, but according to Margaret's interpretation, I needed to switch to still fishing only. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and I was starting to realize that was exactly the point. Margaret wasn't trying to regulate my fishing. She was trying to drive me away entirely. Every rule was more arbitrary and punitive than the last. But then came the incident that changed everything. It was a Saturday evening in early June when I hooked into the biggest bass I'd caught since moving back home. The fish hit hard and fought beautifully, diving deep and making several strong runs before I finally managed to work it to the dock. It was a gorgeous largemouth, probably 4 pounds, with a kind of broad shoulders and deep belly that spoke of years of good living in these waters. The kind of fish Dad would have been absolutely thrilled to see. I was kneeling on the dock, carefully removing the hook so I could release the fish unharmed, when I heard footsteps behind me. Margaret had brought reinforcements this time. Dale Hoffman and 2 residents I didn't recognize, all of them standing at the edge of my yard like they were conducting an official inspection. "Sarah," Margaret called out, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss your fishing activities." I looked up from the fish, which was still struggling in my hands. "What's the problem now?" "Actually, that's exactly what we need to address." Margaret pulled out a surveyor's map and spread it on the dock. "This is the official plat map for Lakeside Estates. As you can see, all properties end at the original high water mark. Everything below that line, including this dock, is classified as common area." I stared at the map, trying to process what she was saying while the bass continued to fight in my grip. "That's impossible. My father's deed clearly shows water frontage." "Your father's deed shows frontage to the original shoreline, which is approximately 15 feet inland from where this dock begins." Margaret pointed to a line on the map. "The dock itself has always been community property. Your father was simply a long-term trespasser." The fish gave a particularly strong thrash. "You're saying this dock that my father built isn't even on his property?" "We're prepared to be reasonable about this," she continued. "But there need to be consequences for the unauthorized usage. I calculate approximately 47 fishing sessions on community property without proper permits. At $50 per violation, that comes to $2,350 in fines." The bass went limp in my hands. "You've killed it," I whispered, staring at the fish that had been fighting so hard just moments before. "Pardon me," Margaret said. I stood up slowly, the dead fish still in my hands, and felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. "You've killed it. This fish was fine until you showed up with your maps and your fines and your need to turn everything into a power game." "Sarah, I don't think. Get off my property." My voice was quiet, but something in my tone made all 4 of them take a step back. Actually, as we've just established, this isn't technically your. Get off my property. They left, but Margaret made sure to have the last word. You have 24 hours to respond to the violation notice, Sarah. That night, I finally decided to stop being reasonable. I drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of every document related to my property and the Lakeside Estates development. What I found was a bureaucratic mess, but buried in the paperwork was something that made my hands shake. The lake itself wasn't community property. According to the deed records, it had been privately owned by the original developer, Marcus Carrington, who'd sold individual waterfront lots while retaining ownership of the water rights. When Carrington died in 1994, his estate had been tied up in probate for 3 years. During that time, the HOA had simply assumed control of lake management, claiming it was necessary for community maintenance. But here's the part that made my hands shake as I read through the documents. The transfer had never been properly executed. Carrington's heir, his daughter Elizabeth, had signed a preliminary agreement to sell the lake to the community trust for $100,000. But the final sale documents were never completed, the money was never paid, and Elizabeth Carrington had died in 2003 without ever following up on the incomplete transaction. According to the property records, Elizabeth Carrington's estate had been inherited by her only child, a daughter who'd moved to Seattle for college in the 1980s and built a career in software engineering. A daughter who'd married young, divorced, and gone back to using her maiden name. A daughter named Sarah Chen, whose mother's maiden name had been Elizabeth Carrington. My mother, who died when I was 12, had inherited the lake. And when she died, it had passed to me. For 22 years, I'd owned the very lake that Margaret Thornfield claimed gave her authority to control my fishing activities. I spent the next week consulting with the most expensive property law attorney I could find. What I learned was that my ownership was solid. Yes, I owned the lake. Yes, I had the legal right to control access and usage. The HOA had been collecting lake maintenance fees from residents for years, essentially charging people for access to my property. My attorney explained my options. I could sell the lake to the community for fair market value, negotiate a settlement, or assert my ownership rights and limit access however I saw fit. That last option would be the nuclear option, guaranteed to create chaos. But it would also immediately establish that Margaret had no authority over lake usage. I thought about the reasonable approach, calling Margaret privately and negotiating some kind of settlement. But every time I started to pick up the phone, I thought about that dead base. I thought about Margaret standing on my dock, calling my father a long-term trespasser. I thought about the harassment disguised as community standards. Margaret had made it personal. So I decided to make it personal right back. On a Thursday morning, I drove to the nearest sign shop and ordered 12 large metal signs. Each sign was 2 feet by 3 feet, with bold red lettering on white background. Private property. No trespassing. Lake access prohibited. Violators will be prosecuted. I spent Saturday morning installing them at every access point around the lake. One at the end of each dock, one at each beach area, one at the community pavilion. By noon, the entire lake was posted. I also had my attorney draft a formal notice to the HOA, informing them that I was the legal owner and that all previous lake maintenance fees had been obtained under false pretenses. The letter demanded an accounting of all funds collected and that the HOA cease regulating access to my property. I hand-delivered copies to Margaret, every board member, and the management company. Then I sat on my dock and waited for the phone to ring. It took exactly 47 minutes. Sarah, this is Margaret Thornfield, and you need to remove those signs immediately. Hello, Margaret. I'm simply posting my property to prevent further trespassing. Your property? The lake is community property. Actually, Margaret, it's been my property for over 20 years. You just didn't know it. I could hear her breathing change. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that my mother was Elizabeth Carrington, and when she died, I inherited the lake. The sale to your community trust was never completed, never paid for, and never legally executed. For 2 decades, your HOA has been charging residents fees for access to my property. The silence stretched out for 30 seconds. That's impossible. I have the deed, Margaret. I have the probate records. And I have a property attorney who's very interested in discussing 20 years of unauthorized lake management fees. Sarah, you need to think about what you're doing here. This affects the entire community. The way you thought about how your harassment was affecting me? Look, we've had our differences, but you killed a fish because you were so eager to establish dominance. You called my father a trespasser. You've spent months making my life miserable for sport. What do you want? And there it was. Margaret Thornfield was finally asking what I wanted. First, you're going to publicly retract every fine and issue a full refund. Second, I want a written apology. Third, I want your resignation as HOA president. Absolutely not. Then enjoy explaining to your neighbors why they can't use the lake anymore. Over the next week, Lakeside Estates turned into a battlefield. My signs stayed up, and I enforced them. When residents tried to use the lake, I politely but firmly informed them they were trespassing. The community was in chaos. Property values started dropping as word spread that the lake was no longer accessible. Margaret tried everything. She had the sheriff come out, but he confirmed I had every right to post my property. She had a surveyor verify the boundaries. She tried to have me cited for creating a public nuisance, but since it was private property, there was no case. Meanwhile, my attorney was having a field day. The HOA's records showed they'd collected over $300,000 in lake maintenance fees over the past decade without legal authority. The management company was panicking about liability. The insurance carrier was asking pointed questions. By the end of the second week, Margaret was facing a full revolt. The emergency community meeting had turned into a screaming match about how the board had allowed this to happen. People were demanding her resignation. That's when Margaret made her final mistake. She decided to make it personal. I was gardening when I heard voices from the lake. I found Margaret and 3 residents standing next to my dock, apparently planning to remove my signs. Margaret, you need to leave. Now. She turned with pure hatred in her eyes. You think you've won something here. But you've destroyed a community. You've wrecked people's investments. All because you're a bitter, selfish woman who can't get over her daddy issues. The words hit like a physical blow. Get off my property. Your precious daddy was a loser, Sarah. An antisocial weirdo who never contributed anything. And now you're just like him. Something snapped inside me. You know what, Margaret? You're right. I am like my father. He taught me to be patient, to be respectful, to work within the system. But he also taught me to stand up to bullies. I pulled out my phone and called my attorney. Dan, I need you to file the lawsuit tomorrow morning. All of it, the unauthorized fees, the property improvements, the harassment. And I want to pursue criminal charges. Margaret's face went white. Sarah, wait. Let's talk about this. Talk? Like we talked when you fined me for being 15 minutes early? Like we talked when you called my father a trespasser? I kept the phone pressed to my ear. You have 24 hours to call an emergency board meeting. You're going to resign and apologize publicly. The board is going to negotiate a fair usage agreement. And you're going to pay for the fish stocking program for the next 5 years. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow morning, every resident wakes up to news that their HOA has been stealing from them, their main amenity is permanently closed, and their property values are tanking because you couldn't resist bullying a grieving woman. The emergency meeting was held the following evening, and it was standing room only. Margaret called it to order, but her usual commanding presence was gone. "We're here to discuss a serious situation regarding lake access," she began, her voice barely audible. "It has come to our attention that there may be complications with the community's ownership of lake property." What followed was 20 minutes of the most humiliating public confession I've ever witnessed. Margaret had to explain how she'd been harassing me over property I actually owned. She had to admit the HOA had been collecting fees without legal authority. The room erupted. People were shouting, demanding answers. Finally, someone asked the question everyone was thinking: what does this mean for our property values? That's when I stood up. I want everyone to understand that I have no interest in destroying this community. The lake has been a community amenity for 30 years, and I see no reason why that can't continue. I could see relief on people's faces. However, things are going to be different. First, I'll be establishing a formal license agreement for community access in exchange for a reasonable annual fee. Second, the arbitrary regulations will be replaced with simple, reasonable guidelines. And third, there will be new leadership. Margaret has demonstrated she's more interested in power than service. That got actual applause. Person after person stood up to share their own stories of HOA harassment. It wasn't just about me and the lake. Margaret had been terrorizing the entire community for years. When the formal vote came, it was unanimous. Margaret was removed as president. The board voted to negotiate a lake usage agreement with me and to eliminate all punitive regulations. 3 days later, Margaret showed up at my door one final time. She looked terrible. "Sarah, I want to apologize. I was wrong. About the fishing, about the fines, about your father. I let power go to my head, and I took out my frustrations on you because you seemed like an easy target." I was an easy target, Margaret. I was grieving and isolated. And you saw weakness and decided to exploit it. She handed me an envelope. "This is a check for all the fines, plus interest. And a personal apology letter." The check was for $1,247. The letter was 2 pages of genuine contrition. "Why now?" I asked. Margaret's composure cracked. "Because my daughter told me she was ashamed to be related to me. She said I'd become a petty tyrant who uses rules as weapons." 3 months later, Lakeside Estates had settled into a new normal. The lake usage agreement was fair and straightforward. The arbitrary fine system had been eliminated. Property values had actually increased once word spread that the lake was now managed by someone who actually owned it. And I finally got to fish in peace. On warm evenings, I'd sit on Dad's dock with his vintage rod, watching the sunset and feeling that connection I'd been searching for. The base population had recovered beautifully thanks to the stocking program Margaret was funding. I'd even started teaching fly casting lessons for kids in the community. Margaret kept her word about making things right. She'd moved away 6 months later, selling to a young family who actually appreciated the community instead of trying to control it. But the most satisfying part was the letter I received from Margaret's daughter. "Thank you for holding her accountable. What you did forced her to confront her behavior and make real changes. She's been going to therapy and actually working on becoming a better person." That's when I understood that the real victory hadn't been about property rights or revenge. It had been about standing up for myself when it mattered, about refusing to be victimized, about using power responsibly when I finally had it. Dad had taught me to fish, but life had taught me when to set the hook. If you've ever dealt with an HOA bully, let me know in the comments what you would have done. Would you have negotiated longer or gone nuclear from the beginning? And if you want more stories about people who thought they could push others around until they met their match, hit that subscribe button. I've got plenty more where this came from.